They started in a Texas bar with a handful of veterans, and one conviction the rules didn't apply to them. 6 decades later, law enforcement on 3 continents had spent hundreds of millions trying to bring them down. They never managed it. These are the 10 most dangerous bandidos in the world. Number 10. Jimmy Graves. Witness elimination and the price of testifying. Before the Bandidos became the international criminal organization the Justice Department would spend decades trying to dismantle, they were still working out were actually capable of. Jimmy Graves helped answer that question in the spring of 1972 in a way that set a precedent every subsequent generation of the club would understand clearly. Testifying against a bandido could get you killed, and the club was willing to reach as far as necessary to make sure that message landed permanently. The target was a man named Charles Edwin Overfield, 29 years old, a father, a sergeant in the National Guard, a man with no criminal history, no meaningful connection to the outlaw motorcycle world, and no apparent awareness of the danger he was in. What connected him to the Bandidos was a single thing. He was scheduled to testify against Robert Powell, a Bandidos associate who had been charged with attempting to burglarize a National Guard armory in Louisiana and subsequently attempting to bribe a witness to ensure his silence. Overfield had witnessed enough to seal Powell's conviction. More critically, the thread his testimony would pull on threatened to expose connections between the Bandidos and weapons acquisition networks the club had no interest in making visible to any court. Overfield was not a criminal. He was not a rival. He was not someone who had wronged the club or challenged its authority or crossed any line in the outlaw world. He was simply a man who knew something, who intended to say it under oath, and whose doing so was inconvenient to the organization. That was enough. On the 9th of March, 1972, while Overfield was traveling Interstate 20 near the Texas-Louisiana border on his way to fulfill that obligation, his vehicle was ambushed. Gunfire tore through it. He was killed before he ever reached the courthouse where his testimony had been scheduled. The killing was clean, deliberate, and efficient, in the way that only premeditated violence against a specific identified target tends to be. No collateral casualties, no confusion about the motive. Just a man removed before he could say what he knew, in a manner designed to ensure the removal was permanent. The investigation moved quickly by the standards of 1972 organized crime work. Graves, a member of the Dallas chapter, was identified and connected to the killing within months. In July 1972, barely 4 months after the murder, he pleaded guilty and received a life sentence. There was no elaborate conspiracy to untangle, no years-long surveillance operation required to establish the chain of command. A witness was going to testify against a Bandidos associate. A Bandidos member killed him first. The logic was that direct, and the verdict followed at roughly the same pace. What Graves's case established in the club's institutional history wasn't limited to a single murder conviction. It was the earliest documented proof that the Bandidos were willing to step outside their own world entirely to target civilians, government employees, agents of the justice system to protect their people and their operations. He demonstrated, at the very beginning of the club's documented criminal history, that the organization would reach as far as it needed to silence a threat, regardless of whether that threat carried a weapon or simply a knowledge of what had happened and a willingness to say so in public. Every case that follows on this list operates, in some form, on the same logic Graves introduced in 1972. The price of threatening the Bandidos was the possibility of paying with your life, and the club, from its earliest years, was serious about collecting. Number 9. Robert James Watson III, Johnny James Watson, and Danny J. Kelly Jr., the Kuryaga family. There are crimes that define how law enforcement understands an organization, and there are crimes that define how the public does. The murders of the Kuryaga family in Bellingham, Washington, belong to the second category, a killing so complete in its erasure of an entire household, so methodical in its execution, so indifferent to the presence of children, that it forced everyone watching to confront what the Bandidos' reach actually looked like when it crossed from the criminal world into the ordinary one. Johnny Kuryaga ran a restaurant. He was well known enough in Bellingham that his murder produced genuine community shock, the kind that comes when a familiar face behind a counter turns out to have been living a second life that most of his customers never suspected. That second life, investigators established, involved cocaine trafficking. He moved product up from California, kept tens of thousands of dollars in cash cycling through his operation, and was connected deeply enough to the Bandidos' supply chain that a falling out with that chain was never going to resolve quietly. The specific trigger involved theft, a severed supply relationship, and a friendship that had already been destroyed before the violence began. Danny Kelly Jr. had been prospecting for the Bandidos under the sponsorship of Robert Watson, the vice president of the Bellingham chapter. Kelly and Johnny Kuryaga had once been close enough that Kelly stood as best man at his wedding. When Kuryaga accused Kelly of theft, the friendship ended, and in the world Kelly now occupied, a betrayal delivered in those terms demanded a response that went far beyond a broken relationship. The club's calculus about consequences was simple and consistent. Certain kinds of disrespect had to be answered in ways that left no ambiguity about what the answer was. What followed was not impulsive. The killing of the Kuryaga family was organized, sequential, and complete. 3 members of the household were shot dead inside the home. Johnny Kuryaga himself was taken alive from the scene, not killed there, but removed, which meant there was planning involved, a destination selected in advance, a sequence of events that required coordination among the men carrying it out. His body was found days later, burned inside his truck, abandoned on a rural property. He had been transported somewhere specific and killed there, the burning of the vehicle designed to eliminate physical evidence that might connect what happened at the house to what happened on that rural road. The detail that would define the case in the public consciousness for years came from the house itself. A 16-year-old member of the family, bleeding from gunshot wounds he had survived the initial attack long enough to sustain, found enough strength to dial 911. He told the operator his family had been shot. He gave his location. He stayed on the line. And then the killers, who had not left the scene, realized what he had done. They returned to him. They placed a pillow against his head. They fired. And then they set the house on fire and disappeared into the night, the same way they had arrived, without hesitation, without apparent remorse, and without any evident awareness that what they were doing was different in kind from any other operational decision they had made that evening. The boy did not survive. The case stretched on for years, the kind of investigation that requires the slow accumulation of physical evidence, witness reconstruction, and forensic patience that murders this methodically executed tend to demand. Robert Watson's own chapter president, when the killings became known within the club, reportedly condemned what had happened and stated that women and children were off-limits under any code the Bandidos operated by. That condemnation was a statement about public relations and organizational optics, not a moral reckoning. It meant nothing to the family that had been inside the house. It meant nothing to the 16-year-old who called for help and was killed on the phone. In 2024, the timeline of justice in cases this deliberately obscured measured not in months, but in years. Robert Watson, Johnny Watson, and Danny Kelly were sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences arrived more than a decade after the killings, long enough that the full weight of what had happened had been absorbed by everyone who knew the Kuryaga family, and then processed, and then lived with, and then carried forward into a courthouse where 3 men stood and heard their futures announced in terms that left nothing ambiguous. One of the club's most senior figures in Bellingham had sponsored the man at the center of it. That detail matters not because it implicates the Bandidos institutionally. In a court of law, the legal record is more specific than that, but because it illustrates the specific kind of network the club created. A social infrastructure in which the distinction between personal grievance and club business becomes genuinely difficult to locate, where a stolen friendship and a dead family and a 16-year-old's last phone call all trace back to the same set of relationships and obligations and debts. Number 8. Richard Steven Mea, the enforcer who burned both sides. Some men on this list built the Bandidos, some of them ran it. Richard Steven Mea was neither. He was something the club produced without designing for it, a man so violent he became useful, then so uncontrollable he became a liability, then, ultimately, the instrument the federal government used against the very leadership he had served. He is, in the specific accounting of damage done to the organization, one of the most costly members in the Bandidos' documented history, not because of what he did for the club, but because of what he told prosecutors about it. Mea joined the Bandidos in the early 2000s and moved fast. In late 2001, Bandidos secretary Xavier Negrete was shot and killed outside a billiards hall in San Antonio. The club identified the shooter as a man named Robert Lara, and retaliation followed in the deliberate, authorized manner that characterized the club's internal justice system at its most organized. In 2002, Mea was awarded the Bandidos Expect No Mercy patch, a designation that the club conferred only on members who had committed documented acts of violence in service of the organization. A formal acknowledgement, worn visibly on the back of a man's cut, that said something specific and unambiguous to anyone in the outlaw world who understood what it meant. In August 2004, Mea stabbed and killed Robert Pisin Koga during an argument. Koga was a San Antonio boxing champion, the city's first world title holder, and a recognizable, widely respected figure in a community where boxing carried genuine cultural weight. His killing drew the kind of public attention the Bandidos could not manage, absorb, or redirect. A beloved local athlete, dead at the hands of a patched member in a dispute, the club could not credibly connect to any organizational business. The Bandidos moved quickly to distance themselves, issuing public statements that the murder was personal, that Mea had acted entirely on his own, that the club's involvement began and ended with the fact that he happened to be a member at the time. He had acted on his own, that was true, but it didn't matter in the way the club hoped it would, because the public disavowal that followed had a consequence the club's leadership may not have fully anticipated. It told Mea clearly and explicitly that the organization he had killed for the organization that had given him his Expect No Mercy patch, that had folded him into its hierarchy and asked him to prove his loyalty in the way he understood best, was now unwilling to stand with him when the cost of standing became visible. The Brotherhood had a price ceiling, and Mea's last act had exceeded it. Inside federal custody, Mea made a decision that would move through the Bandidos' leadership structure like a slow-acting poison. He began cooperating with federal prosecutors, not on peripheral matters, not on minor crimes that could be compartmentalized and managed, but on the operational heart of the organization. He described murders, the drug trafficking networks that funded the club's expansion, the escort services the Bandidos ran as criminal revenue streams, and most critically, for the federal case that was already being constructed, the chain of command that connected orders given at the national level to acts carried out on the ground. He described how the club decided who needed to be killed, who authorized that decision, and how the authorization moved from the men who made it to the men who carried it out. His testimony was central to the racketeering prosecution of National President Jeffrey Fay Pike and National Vice President John Xavier Portillo. Defense attorneys at both trials argued that Mea was lying, that a man publicly expelled from the Brotherhood, left without the protection of the patch he had earned in blood, had manufactured or dramatically embellished testimony to punish the men he blamed for his exposure. There was probably truth in that framing. A man testifying against former brothers after being abandoned by them is not a neutral witness, and federal prosecutors knew it. But the question of whether Mea's motivation was pure is different from the question of whether what he said was accurate, and the physical evidence, the financial records, and the corroborating testimony from other sources gave the case legs that it wouldn't have had on Mea's word alone. He was convicted of the killings that had earned him his patch and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. He would spend those years knowing that the club had tried to discard him, and that he had, in the process of defending himself against that discarding, helped deliver two of the most senior figures in the organization to federal cells of their own. The Expect No Mercy patch was meant as a credential. In Mea's case, it became a record of what he owed and what he was eventually willing to trade. Number 7. Howard Wayne, Baker, the chapter president who directed a public execution. Leadership in the Bandidos came with power, visibility, and a specific legal exposure that most members understood in the abstract, but chapter presidents had to calculate constantly. Under Texas's law of parties, you did not need to fire a weapon to be convicted of murder. Directing violence, being the person who organized, led, and orchestrated an act of killing, made you as legally culpable as the man who pulled the trigger. Howard Wayne Baker, president of the Fort Worth chapter, either miscalculated that exposure or decided it didn't apply to him. The jury that convicted him took less than a day to determine that it did. December 2014. Baker led a contingent of Bandidos into a confrontation that had been building with a combination of rivals, including members of the Ghost Riders, the Cossacks, and a local crew operating in Fort Worth. What Baker organized and led was not a bar fight that escalated. It was a coordinated operation, dozens of Bandidos moving together with a specific target identified in advance, in a space where that target had people he cared about watching. Jeffrey Brady was 41 years old and a member of the Ghost Riders. Inside the space where the Bandidos arrived that night, he was surrounded. He was dragged outside. He was executed in front of his wife and friends in a parking lot. 2 other people were wounded before the Bandidos withdrew. The deliberateness of it, the encirclement, the specific extraction of Brady from the space, the public nature of what followed, was not incidental. It was the point. The Bandidos' response to a challenge from a smaller rival club was designed to be seen, and it was. At Baker's trial in 2017, prosecutors walked the jury through the reconstruction of that night with the kind of evidentiary patience that cases built on multiple witnesses and physical evidence allow. Baker had not personally fired the weapon that killed Brady. That point was established and acknowledged, but he had led the group into the location. He had been inside the ring that formed around Brady, and he had, according to the prosecution's reconstruction, supported by witness accounts from multiple people present, given the direction that organized what happened next. Under Texas's law of parties, the distinction between the man who fired and the man who told others to fire had no legal significance. Both were killers in the eyes of the statute. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Baker was found guilty of murder, aggravated assault, engaging in organized criminal activity, and directing a street gang. In June 2017, he received 45 years for the murder, with the remaining charges either merged or running concurrently. What Baker's case illustrated with particular clarity was a truth about what Bandidos chapter presidents actually did that the club's public mythology of fraternal brotherhood and personal freedom deliberately obscured. They weren't riders who happened to be in charge. They were operational commanders who organized acts of violence, directed the men beneath them, and bore, at least in the state of Texas, legal responsibility for the outcomes those acts produced. The patch on Baker's back said something about his role in the organization. The verdict said the same thing in different language. Number 6. Christopher Jake Carazole, Waco, and the deadliest biker shootout in American history. The 17th of May, 2015, a Sunday, the Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco, Texas, fills through the morning with bikers from across the state. By early afternoon, the parking lot holds hundreds of motorcycles, 2 rival clubs that have been escalating toward open conflict for months, and a police presence that law enforcement positioned outside the location because they already knew what might happen when both clubs arrived at the same place, at the same time. None of it was enough. By the time the shooting stopped, 9 people were dead, 18 were wounded, and 177 individuals were in custody, a number so large that authorities had to commandeer city buses to transport them. It was the deadliest biker confrontation in the recorded history of the United States. Christopher Jake Carazole was president of the Bandidos Dallas chapter and one of the central figures of what happened that afternoon. The backstory is specific. The Cossacks were a Texas motorcycle club that had been expanding aggressively through the state's central and northern corridors, growing fast enough to make the Bandidos uncomfortable, and doing so with a deliberateness that suggested they understood exactly whose territory they were entering. In the Bandidos' understanding of Texas, the state was theirs by the logic of original occupation that they had founded the club there, had held it for 5 decades, and expected clubs operating within its geography to acknowledge that precedent, formally and visibly. The Cossacks had been refusing that expectation with increasing directness. The Bandidos had been responding to that refusal with increasing pressure. Waco was where both trajectories converged. What precisely triggered the gunfire, who made the first physical contact, who drew a weapon first, What specific sequence of provocations carried a tense political meeting into open shooting in a crowded parking lot remains legally unresolved and genuinely contested. What is not contested is that the guns came out, and that when they did, the killing was fast and definitive. 9 bikers died. The majority of the dead were Cossacks. Carazole was present. At trial, he acknowledged firing his weapon, but testified that he acted in self-defense, that a Cossack had physically attacked him, that he had been in genuine fear for his life, that the shooting was reactive rather than planned. He also described, with a particularity that gave his testimony texture regardless of the legal framing, watching his father himself, a patched bandido, take a bullet to the shoulder in the chaos. The trial produced a hung jury. The jurors could not reach a verdict. In the aftermath of the Waco prosecution's broader collapse, driven by legal challenges to the identical probable cause affidavits applied to all 177 arrestees without individual assessment of each person's conduct, all charges against all defendants were dropped. The most lethal biker confrontation in American history produced no convictions. The legal outcome was the result of genuine procedural failures in how the post-shooting arrests were handled, not a commentary on what happened in that parking lot. 9 people remained dead. The families of the dead remained without the verdict that prosecutors had initially promised them. In May 2024, Carazole's name returned to Texas headlines. He and a fellow bandido were accused of revving motorcycles outside a Dallas man's home after midnight, then kicking in the door and pointing a handgun through the glass when the resident came to confront them. He was charged with aggravated assault and released on bond. What Carazole's position on this list reflects is not simply the events of one afternoon in Waco. It is the combination of scale and consequence. 9 dead, an entire prosecution collapsed, and the continuation of conduct that suggested nothing about those events had changed the calculations of the man at the center of them. The deadliest biker shootout in American history, and the chapter president who walked out of it still wearing the patch. Number 5. Ronnie Hajj, the man who built the machine. If Donald Chambers founded the Bandidos, Ronnie Hajj, who led the club through the critical decade of its transformation from a Texas regional organization into a national criminal enterprise, built the machine that made everything that followed possible. He built it methodically, ruthlessly, and with a strategic intelligence that law enforcement at the time repeatedly underestimated. Hajj was a former Marine who earned the nickname Mr. Prospect for the speed with which he moved through the club's probationary period, a reference to how briefly he occupied that status before being voted into full membership. When Chambers was imprisoned following his 1,972 murder conviction, leadership of the Bandidos passed to Hajj. He styled himself the stepmother, a dark acknowledgement of Chambers' own nickname, Mother, and a statement of intent about what his role would be. He was not a replacement. He was a continuation and an amplification. He began by purging. Members he regarded as insufficiently loyal, insufficiently disciplined, or insufficiently committed to the vision he had for the organization were removed. Entire chapters Montana, Indiana were shut down under his authority, not because they had committed crimes that embarrassed the club, but because Hajj had assessed them and found them lacking. The organization shrank before it grew, and it shrank deliberately, the way you trim a structure before you rebuild it stronger. In 1978, Hajj brought the Bandidos to Daytona Beach's Bike Week for the first time and forged an alliance with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. The arrangement that emerged from that week was straightforward and profitable at a scale that transformed the Bandidos' financial capacity. The Outlaws supplied cocaine from Florida, the Bandidos supplied methamphetamine from Texas and the Southwest, and both clubs moved product through each other's established distribution networks, expanding their reach into markets that neither could access alone. That partnership elevated the Bandidos into the tier of organizations that law enforcement referred to as the Big Four, alongside the Hells Angels, the Outlaws themselves, and the Pagans. It was Hajj who got them there. By 1983, a conflict with the Banshees Motorcycle Club, a Texas club that had former Bandidos among its membership, which the club regarded as a specific and personal kind of insult, produced one of the most operationally elaborate acts of violence the Bandidos had yet attempted. Hajj's response to the Banshees' challenge was not impulsive. It was planned over weeks, funded through a direct assessment levied on every Bandidos member across the country, and executed with a level of operational security that reflected everything he had built since taking over from Chambers. 2 bombing targets were selected, Banshee residences in Dallas. To provide cover for the men who would carry out the attacks, Hajj staged 2 large parties simultaneously, one in Rapid City, South Dakota, and one in Corpus Christi, Texas. The Texas party was publicly advertised as a poker run, benefiting a cerebral palsy foundation, giving most Bandidos members a visible, documented presence somewhere other than Dallas, while a separate, compartmentalized team planted the devices. The explosives themselves were stolen from the back of a demolition supply truck by a national officer sent specifically to Houston to acquire them. 1 bomb detonated under a van at a Banshee house, damaging property but injuring no one. The second device went off when a Banshee leader attempted to drive a van with his infant daughter inside. Neither was seriously hurt, an outcome that owed everything to chance and nothing to restraint. The botched attacks drew precisely the kind of sustained federal attention that Hajj's operational security had been designed to prevent. By 1985, the DEA, ATF, and FBI had launched a coordinated national operation. A trusted enforcer named Randy Hansen, facing serious personal exposure and reportedly afraid for his life, defected and provided investigators with an interior map of the Texas Bandidos' operations, the weapons stockpiles, the safe houses, the chain of command that connected Hajj directly to the bombing plot. In 1988, 23 members and associates were federally indicted. Most were arrested quickly. Hajj was convicted of racketeering charges connected to the bombing operation and received a 5-year sentence. Law enforcement declared publicly at the time that the conviction marked the effective end of the Bandidos as a functioning criminal organization. They were wrong. The infrastructure Hajj had built was more durable than the legal consequences he faced, and the club he had shaped absorbed his conviction the same way it would absorb every subsequent blow over the following 30 years by continuing to exist, continuing to recruit, and continuing to operate. Number 4. John Xavier Portillo, running the empire from inside. If Pike was the face of the Bandidos at their most powerful, John Xavier Portillo was the mechanism. Pike held the national presidency. Portillo, as national vice president, managed the operational reality of what that presidency meant, the authorization of violence, the management of drug distribution across the club's territory, the enforcement of the organization's internal code against anyone who tested it. He was the man who answered the question of what happened when someone needed to be handled. In the Bandidos at their peak, the answer was consistent, and it ran through him. 2 acts of violence in particular define Portillo's position in the club's history, and together they illustrate something specific about how the organization made decisions at the national level. The first involved the 2002 death of Robert Lara, killed after being identified as the shooter responsible for the murder of Bandidos secretary Xavier Negrete. Portillo's role in authorizing the retaliation against Lara, the chain of command that moved from the identification of a target to the decision that the target would be removed, was among the acts prosecutors used to establish the pattern of racketeering that federal law requires for a RICO conviction. The second was more strategically revealing, the 2006 assassination of Anthony Benish. Benish had been attempting to establish a Hells Angels chapter in Austin. In the Bandidos framework for understanding Texas, this was not a business decision made by an individual with no connection to them. It was a territorial provocation made in a state the club regarded as its home by a rival organization the Bandidos had been competing with for decades. The Hells Angels, putting a chapter in Austin, was, in the Bandidos' calculus, an act of institutional aggression that required an institutional response. Benish was shot outside a restaurant in Austin in a manner that left no ambiguity about what the shooting meant and who had authorized it. Prosecutors at Portillo's 2018 federal trial in San Antonio used these killings and the documented chain of authorization, connecting them to the national leadership as the evidentiary spine of the racketeering case. The argument they made, and the argument that the jury accepted, was not that Portillo had personally carried out violence or that he could be connected to specific acts by direct physical evidence alone. It was that he had occupied a position in a criminal hierarchy where significant violence was authorized from the top, that he had used that position to direct specific outcomes. Portillo was convicted on racketeering, murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, assault, and firearms charges. In September 2018, the sentence arrived: 2 consecutive life terms plus 20 additional years in federal prison. He was also ordered to forfeit firearms, a motorcycle, and cash seized from his home. The men who had feared John Portillo across Texas's outlaw world watched a federal judge sentence him to die in a cell. For the Bandidos, as an institution, the simultaneous loss of both their national president and national vice president in the same prosecution represented the most significant structural damage their leadership had ever sustained. The club survived it, as it survived everything but not unchanged, and not without cost. Number 3. Jeffrey Fay Pike, the president who presided over the peak. Jeffrey Fay Pike was born in Northern California in the late 1950s. He dropped out of high school and relocated to Texas by the early 1970s, spent the following years working ordinary jobs, dishwasher, cook, construction, and gave no early indication of what he would eventually become. In 1979, he joined the Bandidos motorcycle club. He was in his early 20s. He would not stay ordinary. Pike rose through the organization with a strategic patience that distinguished him from most of the men around him. He was not impulsive. He was not visibly reckless. He understood the club's internal politics with the precision of someone who had been studying them for years before he had any power to shape them, and he rose because he understood when to wait and when to move, which rivalries to leverage and which to manage, which men to bring close and which to isolate before they became problems. By the mid-2000s, he had reached the highest position in the organization, national president of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Under Pike's presidency, the Bandidos were at what was probably the apex of their organizational power. The club's territorial reach extended across North America and deep into international chapters on multiple continents. Their drug trafficking operations were sophisticated enough to operate across state and international lines without constant disruption. Their rivals, including the Cossacks in Texas, were being managed through a combination of pressure and strategic violence that Pike had sanctioned from the top of the command structure. The 2006 assassination of Anthony Benish, a man killed in Austin for attempting to open a Hells Angels chapter in Bandidos territory, happened under Pike's presidency, according to federal prosecutors, with his knowledge and approval. This was not a crime of passion committed by a member acting alone. It was authorized violence carried out through the club's chain of command, with Pike at the top of that chain. The Waco shootout of the 17th of May, 2015, happened under Pike's presidency as well. 9 dead, 18 wounded, 177 arrested. Pike was not physically present at Twin Peaks that afternoon. Prosecutors argued that his absence from the scene was legally irrelevant, that the confrontation between the Bandidos and the Cossacks that produced 9 bodies in a parking lot was the direct product of the organizational posture he had established, the insistence on territorial dominance in Texas, the escalating sanctions against the Cossacks for refusing to acknowledge Bandidos' authority, the culture of authorized violence that made it predictable, rather than surprising, that a meeting between the two clubs would produce exactly the outcome it did. Whether that argument would have held in a Waco-specific prosecution was never tested against Pike directly. The mass prosecution collapsed before it reached him on those specific charges. What did reach him was the federal racketeering case that had been building through years of accumulated evidence, informant testimony from men, including Richard Mea, and the investigative infrastructure that multiple agencies had constructed around the club's national leadership. In 2016, federal authorities indicted him on racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and drug trafficking charges. In May 2018, after the San Antonio federal trial, Pike was convicted on all major counts. The sentence was life in federal prison without any practical prospect of release. The man who had led the Bandidos at the height of their power had presided over the assassination of a man attempting to open a rival club's chapter in his state, the deadliest biker confrontation in American history, and a drug trafficking operation that spanned the continent. He had done all of it from the position of national president, using the authority that position carried and the chain of command that position controlled. The jury that convicted him and the judge who sentenced him arrived at the same conclusion the federal government's years-long investigation had, that the Bandidos under Fay Pike were not a motorcycle club that produced criminal members, but a criminal enterprise that wore the motorcycle club as a skin. Number 2. Anthony Mark Spencer. The massacre that went global. Anthony Mark Spencer's childhood is the kind that organized crime histories summarize quickly and move past, because the details resist easy categorization and don't fit the mythology that the outlaw world tends to construct around its most significant figures. He was born in Sydney, into circumstances so fractured that he was never entirely certain the name he carried through his entire life was his actual birth name. His father was absent from the beginning. His mother, who struggled with mental illness that went untreated in the way that mental illness often went untreated in mid-century Australia, eventually took her own life. In an Anglican boys' home where Spencer spent part of his childhood, other boys tried to drown him in a bathtub. He survived. He was barely literate. He kept a private diary filled with spelling errors, the written record of a boy who had no one to talk to and was working out on paper what he couldn't say out loud. He found, in the Comancheros Motorcycle Club, something that resembled belonging. The Comancheros under William Jock Ross were the dominant outlaw organization in Australia, built on a foundation of military-style discipline that reflected Ross's own background and the particular kind of loyalty he demanded from the men who wore his club's colors. For a time, Spencer fit inside that structure. But by the early 1980s, Ross was pushing the Comancheros in a direction Spencer couldn't follow, increasingly paramilitary, increasingly hierarchical, increasingly remote from the version of outlaw brotherhood that Spencer had joined looking for. He rejected the new direction. In 1983, Spencer led a faction that burned their Comancheros colors in a formal act of separation and approached the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in the United States for official recognition as Australia's first chapter. The Americans approved. The first Australian Bandidos chapter was born in Sydney, with Spencer as its founding president. Jock Ross, who interpreted the split as both personal betrayal and an American incursion into Australian outlaw culture, did not accept it. The tension escalated through the months that followed. In August 1984, a phone call between Spencer and Ross effectively served as a declaration of open hostilities. What happened 6 weeks later could not have been fully anticipated by anyone, including the men who had made the decisions that led to it, though the direction of travel, in retrospect, was not hard to read. The 2nd of September, 1984, Father's Day in Australia. The British Motorcycle Club was hosting a swap meet at the Viking Tavern in Milpera, a suburb of Sydney. It was a community event. Food, music, families with children, the ordinary Sunday afternoon texture of a public gathering in a suburb that had no particular reason to be the site of anything extraordinary. Both the Comancheros and Spencer's Bandidos arrived at the location. Both arrived armed. A confrontation developed in the parking lot. At the height of the standoff, as men on both sides faced each other across a distance that could be crossed in seconds, Jock Ross raised a machete and gave a single order. What followed lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 7 people were dead, 4 Comancheros, 2 Bandidos, and Leanne Walters, 14 years old, who had come to a Father's Day swap meet with her family and was killed by crossfire in a war between 2 organizations she had no connection to and no knowledge of. 20 more people were wounded. More than 200 police officers reached the scene. The killing was already finished. The Milpera Massacre, as it was named immediately, and as it has been called ever since, produced consequences that reshaped Australian law entirely. It forced the passage of the country's first serious anti-biker legislation. It changed how Australian law enforcement understood and approached outlaw motorcycle clubs permanently and fundamentally. It put the Bandidos' Australian founding on the front pages of every newspaper in the country in the context of a 14-year-old girl's body in a parking lot. In the years that followed, inquiry after inquiry, parliamentary debate after parliamentary debate, referenced Milpera as the moment when the question of what to do about outlaw clubs stopped being theoretical. Spencer was convicted of manslaughter and served time in Australian custody. The distinction between manslaughter and murder in that verdict satisfied almost no one who had watched the prosecution. and the families of the dead lived with it in the particular way that families live with verdicts that don't match their sense of what happened. The Australian Bandidos chapter that Spencer founded in 1983 continued to grow after Milpera. New chapters opened across the continent. The organization expanded its criminal infrastructure. The international Bandidos that Milpera announced to the world would go on to fight the Hells Angels across Scandinavia with military-grade weapons, to spawn some of the most violent biker conflicts Europe had ever seen, and to become the subject of federal racketeering prosecutions in multiple countries simultaneously. All of it traces back to a decision Spencer made in 1983 and a parking lot confrontation in Milpera in 1984. Leanne Walters was 14 years old. She was at a Father's Day event with her family. She had nothing to do with any of it. Number 1. Donald Eugene Chambers, the founder. Every organization that has ever produced a list like this one traces back to a founding decision. The Bandidos trace back to Donald Eugene Chambers and the decision he made in San Leon, Texas, on the 4th of March, 1966, when he looked at every motorcycle club he had encountered, found all of them lacking, and concluded that if the organization he wanted didn't exist, he would have to build it himself. Chambers was born the 23rd of November, 1930. He served in the United States Marine Corps during the Vietnam War and came home to Texas, carrying whatever the war had given him and whatever it had taken. He worked as a longshoreman. He rode motorcycles with a genuine passion that preceded everything else in this story. He joined clubs and found them inadequate, too soft in their discipline, too loose in their loyalty, too willing to operate within frameworks that someone else had established. The club he built on that March afternoon was named for Mexican bandits, men who lived outside every law that asserted authority over them, who answered to no institution, who took what they needed and left the consequences for everyone else. The name was a statement of philosophy, not just identity. He chose red and gold as the club's colors because they were the colors of the Marine Corps he had served. The mascot, a round-faced figure, grinning, armed with a pistol in one hand and a machete in the other, eventually known throughout the outlaw world as the Fat Mexican, was designed as a declaration about what the Bandidos were and what they thought of the world's opinion of that. He recruited initially from biker bars around Houston and the surrounding area, specifically targeting Vietnam veterans, men who understood discipline and hierarchy, who were comfortable with violence in the particular way that combat experience creates, and who carried the specific disillusionment of men who had served a country that wasn't always certain what to do with them once they came home. Within a few years, the Bandidos had over 100 members. Within a decade, they were a documented criminal organization under active federal surveillance. Within 2 decades, they were one of the most powerful outlaw motorcycle clubs on Earth. Chambers himself did not survive to witness most of that expansion. The darkest chapter of his own story arrived in December 1972, when he and several club members abducted 2 brothers who had sold the Bandidos baking soda in place of amphetamine, a deception that, in the world Chambers operated in, was not a business dispute to be resolved through complaint or arbitration. He drove the brothers into the desert, forced them to dig their own graves, and executed them in the ground they had excavated with their own hands. A club prospect who was present and subsequently turned informant provided the testimony that convicted all 3 men. Each received a life sentence. Chambers was paroled in 1983 after serving roughly a decade. He stepped back from the club's active leadership and eventually withdrew from the Bandidos altogether, settling in El Paso with the quietness that men who have spent years at the center of violent worlds sometimes retreat into when the capacity for that kind of life has been exhausted. While he was still incarcerated, his 23-year-old son, Steven, was shot dead in a Houston nightclub dispute in 1979, a murder that took decades to resolve, and even then resolved badly. In 2016, police arrested a man they believed responsible for Steven's killing, only to discover the actual killer had been operating under a false identity for the entire intervening period. Some endings don't resolve cleanly. Some don't resolve at all. Chambers died of cancer on the 18th of July, 1999, at the age of 68. He was buried in Houston at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery. His gravestone carries his name, the Bandidos insignia, and the motto he had written into the club's identity from its first day. "We are the people our parents warned us about." What places Chambers at the top of this list is not the desert execution of 1972, though that act alone would earn him a position near the top of any serious accounting of the club's violence. It is this: every single person in the 9 entries above him wore a patch that Chambers designed, operated under a code that Chambers established, and represented an organization that would not exist without the specific decision Chambers made on a March afternoon in 1966 when he decided the world's rules were not for him. Every murder documented above, every bombing, every federal racketeering trial, every family destroyed, and every life ended. It traces back through whatever chain of events connects it to the man who built the structure that made all of it possible. Ronnie Hajj could not have built the machine he built without the organization Chambers founded. Fay Pike could not have presided over the club at its peak without the hierarchy Chambers designed. Portillo could not have authorized violence from inside a national leadership structure without the command architecture Chambers created. Anthony Spencer could not have founded Australia's first Bandidos chapter, could not have brought the red and gold to the Southern Hemisphere, could not have put the events of Milpera in motion without the parent organization in Texas that Chambers had built nearly 2 decades earlier. He built something that outlasted him by a quarter century and is still running. He built something that absorbed the convictions of its 2 most senior national leaders in 2018 and kept operating. He built something that survived anti-tank rockets in Scandinavia, federal RICO prosecutions in Nevada, mass arrests in Australia, and the defection of men who knew its deepest operational secrets, and is still, today, recruiting new members, collecting chapter dues, holding meetings in unmarked buildings across 6 continents, and producing the kind of violence that earns men places on lists like this one. The people his parents warned about turned out to be him, and everyone who came after him, and everyone who will come after them. The red and gold patch is still out there. The chapters still meet. The dues still flow up the chain to national leadership. Men still prospect, still prove themselves, still receive their full membership in ceremonies that look almost exactly the way they looked when Chambers organized the first one in San Leon in 1966. The federal government convicted 2 consecutive national presidents in the same prosecution and watched the organization absorb both sentences without collapsing. It has dismantled chapters from Texas to Scandinavia to Australia, spent hundreds of millions of dollars in law enforcement resources, and deployed some of the longest and most complex undercover operations in American federal history against an organization that has survived every prosecution at the institutional level, rebuilt what was broken, and continued. The men on this list are in federal prisons, in Australian penitentiaries, in graves marked with the Bandidos insignia. The club they served, some of them built, is still riding. What the Bandidos share with every organization that has produced this kind of sustained, multi-generational violence is simpler than any federal indictment makes it sound. They offer something that men who have been failed by every other structure tend to need: a hierarchy you chose, built on loyalty you tested, among men who will not leave you behind the way that employers and governments and families sometimes do. The brotherhood is real. The consequences of that brotherhood are also real, and they appear on the other side of this list in 9 dead in a Texas parking lot, in a family erased in Bellingham, in a 14-year-old girl killed at a Father's Day swap meet in Sydney. Donald Chambers was buried at 68, under a gravestone that carries a motto about being the people parents warned about. His son was shot dead in a nightclub before Chambers ever got out of prison. Fay Pike will die in federal custody. Portillo will die in federal custody. Anthony Spencer's founding act on Australian soil produced a massacre that changed Australian law and left a child in a parking lot. The people our parents warned us about turned out to be paying for it the whole time. They just never said so until it was too late to matter. If you made it this far, you already know what to do. Hit the bell. There are more investigations, like this one, coming, cases where the truth is darker than anything the mythology suggests, and where the men who built these worlds almost never got to enjoy them on the terms they imagined when they started.